Welcome to CrimePod Castle. I'm so glad you could join us for the 8th episode of our series, Ghosts of the Past. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into a case that really shook India all the way back in 2003, the murder of Madhumita Shukla.
Yeah, this case was really something else. It wasn't just the brutality of the crime, although that was definitely shocking enough on its own. It was all the layers of power and politics, and in the end, I think just a really, really deeply personal betrayal.
Okay, so let's unpack all of this. First, for anyone who might not remember all the details, can you remind us, who was Madhumita Shukla?
Madhumita, she was a true rising star in the world of Indian poetry, that is. I mean, known for her really powerful words and just her captivating performances, really beautiful and charming too. She moved in certain circles, that included some pretty influential figures from Uttar Pradesh's political elite.
Right, and this is where we first meet Amarmani Tripathi, a powerful politician with a connection to Madhumita that, let's just say, went a little bit beyond just being a fan of her poetry.
Exactly. I mean, everyone knew about their relationship. It was an open secret, basically. Even though, of course, Amarmani was a married man, this entanglement, I guess you could call it, is ultimately what leads us down a very dark path.
So it's May 9th, 2003. Madhumita is at home in Lucknow when two men, they're posing as visitors, arrive at her door. This is where things take a very tragic turn.
Oh, yeah, this was chilling. It was a planned execution, no doubt about it. Two shots fired, at close range, ending Madhumita's life just like that, right there in her own living room. I mean, the whole thing, the precision of it, the swiftness, everything just screamed that this was not some random act. The killers, they knew exactly what they were doing, and they were there for one reason.
God, the nation must have been horrified.
Mhm.
I mean, who would want to silence, this young and talented poet with such just senseless violence?
Well, the investigators, they immediately start digging into Madhumita's personal life. And pretty quickly, her relationship with Amarmani Tripathi takes center stage, so to speak. And then things get even more complicated when the autopsy report comes back.
What did it say?
Well, the autopsy revealed that Madhumita was 7 months pregnant when she was murdered. And the DNA tests, they confirmed that the father was, no surprise here, none other than Amarmani Tripathi.
Wow. Okay, so that throws a whole other level of motive onto this whole thing.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. It seems pretty clear that Madhumita had been, she was pressuring Amarmani to publicly acknowledge the relationship and, of course, acknowledge the child as well, which is something he very much wanted to keep under wraps, He was terrified at the scandal, worried about what it would do to his career, his family life, the whole 9 yards.
So as the investigation, as it kept going, did it start to become clear that, Amarmani's involvement was more than just the motive? Like, was he actually connected to the murder itself?
Yeah, well, the evidence, it really just starts piling up at this point. And it was painting a picture of a really meticulously planned crime. I mean, his phone records, for instance, they showed all this communication between Amarmani and the hitman right before the murder. Then you had financial transactions that showed all this money being transferred to them around the same time. Plus, there were witness testimonies that backed all this up. I mean, it was all pointing to Amarmani and maybe even his wife, Madhumani, too, being involved in the planning and carrying out of this murder.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. So did the police actually end up linking Amarmani directly to the murder itself?
Oh, yeah, they did. One of the biggest pieces of evidence actually came from some of Amarmani's associates. Turns out they had gone to see Madhumita not long before the murder, which pretty much put them right there at the scene of the crime. That, combined with the mountain of other evidence they'd already gathered, created this, undeniable connection between him and what happened.
Okay, so then what happened? What were the consequences of all of this?
Well, when they arrested Amarmani and Madhumani, it sent shockwaves through Uttar Pradesh, This was not your run-of-the-mill criminal case, obviously. This was a high-profile politician, and he was staring down murder charges. The whole nation was absolutely captivated.
God, the trial. I can only imagine. The trial must have been a media frenzy. Everyone wanted to see if justice would actually prevail, especially with someone so powerful in the hot seat, right?
It was a spectacle, that's for sure. The prosecution, they built this ironclad case, laid out all the evidence so meticulously, the DNA, the phone records, financial transactions, witness testimonies, you name it. They even had confessions from the hitmen, directly implicating Amarmani and his wife. But of course, the defense, they weren't just going to roll over, right? I mean, their whole strategy was basically to try to discredit all that evidence, saying it was all circumstantial and, basically that this whole thing was just some big political scheme to frame Amarmani.
So they were basically what, saying he was a victim of some kind of conspiracy? I mean, did that hold any water at all?
Well, I mean, the thing is, the prosecution's case was it was airtight. Like, the weight of the evidence, especially the DNA and those hitmen confessions, you just couldn't get around it.
So what was the public reaction to all of this? I mean, it must have been pretty intense watching this, powerful politician facing such serious charges.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the Madhumita Shukla case, this became like a national obsession, basically. Everyone was glued to their TVs, following every little twist and turn. It felt like the whole country was holding its breath, waiting to see if justice would actually be served, especially when you had, power and influence all mixed up in it.
So what was the verdict? In the end, I mean.
Well, in 2007, after this long, drawn-out, very public trial, both Amarmani and Madhumani Tripathi were found guilty of murder and conspiracy. And they were both sentenced to life in prison.
Wow. A life sentence for a politician. I mean, that's a pretty powerful statement.
It was a landmark case, for sure. A really rare thing in India to see someone so high profile actually held accountable for something so, so awful. I think it sent a real shock through the political landscape. And honestly, it offered a little bit of hope, for people who were starting to lose faith in the justice system.
You mentioned earlier that this case became like a national obsession, right? Why do you think it resonated so much with people?
I think there were a few different things going on there. On the one hand, you had Madhumita, this young, talented woman, I mean, with so much life ahead of her, brutally murdered. And that on its own was a tragedy, no doubt about it. But then you had this other layer, right? That the main suspect was this powerful politician, someone who was supposed to, represent and protect the people he served. And I think at the end of the day, the case really just exposed the dark side of power and, the potential for corruption that can happen within the system. It forced people to face some really uncomfortable truths about how much influence and impunity really can come with political office.
So did the case actually lead to any big changes or reforms in the legal system in India, especially when it came to, crimes that involved influential figures?
That's a tough one to answer. I mean, the Madhumita Shukla case, it didn't directly lead to any like sweeping legal reforms or anything like that, but it definitely got people talking, about accountability and justice. And it put a ton of pressure on the legal system to show that it could handle these big cases fairly and openly, no matter who the person on trial was.
So it kind of started a public debate then about, whether the justice system was biased. Do you think that had any lasting impact on how similar cases were handled?
Oh, I think so, yeah. I mean, the Madhumita Shukla trial, everyone was watching it, and that set a precedent, It showed that the public was paying attention and that they were demanding fairness and transparency. And I think that that kind of awareness, that scrutiny, it probably contributed to a greater sense of accountability, I'd say, within the system, even if it's hard to measure exactly how much impact it had.
Yeah, this case really did highlight just how complicated it can be to try and get justice when you have these powerful individuals involved. So, I mean, beyond just the legal stuff, did Madhumita's case have any lasting impact on Indian society, especially when it comes to how people saw, women seeking justice against powerful figures?
It definitely sparked a big national conversation about how vulnerable women can be, especially when they, dare to challenge the status quo or confront powerful men. Tamita's case really became this symbol almost of the things that women go through when they're trying to get justice against people in positions of authority. It highlighted those systemic problems that can make victims stay silent and protect those who are doing the harming.
God, it's so tragic that something so awful had to happen to bring all these issues to light.
It is a tragedy, but I think Madhumita's story, even though it's so painful, it served as a wake-up call for a lot of people. And it forced society as a whole to confront some of the really harsh realities that women often face when they go up against powerful individuals.
It also, it makes you wonder about what happens after, I mean, what happened to Amarmani Tripathi and Madhumani after they were convicted? Did they actually serve out their sentences?
Ooh, that's a really good question. Because it doesn't quite end there. You see, both of them, Amarmani and Madhumani, they appealed their convictions a bunch of times. And they did spend years in prison, but they were also let out on parole a couple of times, for health reasons, they said. And of course, that made a lot of people furious because, it just felt like another example of how the wealthy and powerful can kind of work the system to their advantage, even after they've been found guilty of really serious crimes.
So even though on paper it seemed like justice had been done, it still felt like true accountability was still out of reach.
Yeah, and it really underscores just how important it is to stay vigilant, and to keep advocating, because the fight for justice doesn't just end when someone's found guilty. It takes real, sustained effort to make sure those sentences are carried out, that parole isn't just given out for flimsy reasons, and that the system isn't being, manipulated by those with power.
The Madhumita Shukla case is it's a powerful reminder that justice, it can be such a long and difficult process,
Yeah.
especially when you're talking about people in positions of power. But it highlights how important public awareness is and public scrutiny when it comes to holding those in power accountable for what they do.
Totally agree. I mean, public pressure, media attention, and, families of the victims who just refuse to give up on justice. Those are the things that make sure these cases aren't just, forgotten about, swept under the rug. And it's through those collective efforts that we can work towards a system where justice is really served, regardless of anyone's wealth or influence.
This deep dive into the Madhumita Shukla murder case has been both captivating and kind of sobering at the same time. It's a story about love, betrayal, power, and, well, this long and complicated fight for justice.
Yeah, it's one of those cases that reminds us that even when you're up against incredible power, the truth can win out in the end. But it takes persistence, courage, and a real commitment from everybody to hold those in power accountable for their actions.
Well, thank you for joining us today for this exploration of the ghosts of the past. We really encourage you to, learn more about this case on your own and just, think about some of the broader issues that it brings up. Don't forget to follow and subscribe to CrimePod Castle for more gripping stories from India's past. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed.
It's definitely a tragedy, but Madhumita's story, as awful as it is, I think it really was a wake-up call for a lot of people. It forced everyone to just look at the really harsh realities that women can face, especially when they're going up against powerful people.
It also, when you hear a story like this, it makes you think about what happens next.
Yes.
Right? I mean, what about Amarmani and Madhumani after they were convicted? Did they actually serve their full sentences?
Oh, that's a good question, because see, it doesn't quite end there. Amarmani and Madhumani, they both appealed the convictions multiple times, actually. And they did spend years in prison. But they were also granted parole a few times for, health reasons. And that, of course, that caused a lot of outrage. A lot of people were furious because it felt like, I don't know, just another example of how the rich and powerful can just kind of work the system, even after they've been convicted of something so serious.
So even though, it seemed like justice had been served, there was still this feeling that they hadn't really been held accountable.
Right. And it shows how important it is to never let up, to keep fighting and pushing for justice, because it doesn't just stop when the gavel comes down. You have to make sure those sentences are actually carried out, that parole isn't granted for, questionable reasons, and that the system isn't being manipulated by those with power, obviously.
The Madhumita Shukla case, it's a stark reminder, isn't it?
Yeah.
That justice, it can be a really, really long and difficult thing to achieve.
Yeah.
Especially when you're dealing with people who have a lot of power and influence. But it also shows how crucial it is to have, public awareness and public scrutiny when it comes to holding those in power accountable.
Couldn't agree more. Public pressure, media attention, and the families of the victims who just refuse to give up. Those are the things that make sure these cases don't just disappear, right? That they're not forgotten. And those efforts, I think, are what ultimately move us toward a system where justice is truly served, no matter who you are, how much money you have, or how influential you are.
Well, this deep dive into the Madhumita Shukla case, it's been fascinating and definitely thought-provoking. It's a story about love, about betrayal, about power, and, this long and difficult fight for justice.
It's one of those cases that shows us that even when you're up against immense power, the truth can come out. But it takes a lot. It takes persistence, it takes courage, and a real commitment to holding those in power accountable for what they do.
Well, thank you so much for joining us for this exploration of the ghosts of the past. We hope you'll, look into this case a little bit more on your own and think about some of the bigger issues that it raises. Don't forget to follow and subscribe to CrimePod Castle for more gripping stories from India's past. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed.